Most people who die from hantavirus were healthy. That's not a sentence designed to frighten you. It's a clinical observation that reshapes the entire conversation about this disease, and most people over 50 have never heard it explained properly. Healthy adults, active people, people without pre-existing conditions, without compromised immune systems, without any obvious reason to be in a high-risk category. They were exposed, their immune systems responded exactly as designed, and that response is precisely what killed them, not the virus working unchecked, the body fighting back too hard, in the wrong place at the wrong time. That mechanism, the immune system as the instrument of its own destruction, is the core of what makes hantavirus uniquely dangerous for people in the second half of their lives. And understanding it isn't just medically interesting. It's the difference between a survivable exposure and one that isn't caught in time. Hantavirus pulmonary syndrome has a case fatality rate that sits between 30 and 40% in the United States. For context, influenza, the standard reference point for serious respiratory illness in public health, kills less than 1% of the people it infects in a severe season. Hantavirus kills roughly 1 in 3. It is not common. But when it happens fast, and it happens hard. And the people most likely to be in environments where exposure occurs, rural properties, seasonal cabins, garages, barns, storage spaces, older homes in rodent-prone regions, are disproportionately in the 50-plus age group. Think about who owns those spaces, who spends weekends clearing out the garage that hasn't been touched since the kids moved out, who opens the hunting cabin in April after it's been sealed since November, who pulls the storage boxes down from the rafters of a barn to make space for a grandchild's visit. This is not a disease of young outdoor adventurers statistically. It's a disease of the specific intersections between age, property ownership, and the kind of enclosed, dusty, long undisturbed spaces that older adults tend to be responsible for. The exposure itself is almost insultingly simple. Sin nombre virus, the strain responsible for the vast majority of hantavirus cases in North America, is carried by the deer mouse, a small, large-eared rodent common across the continental United States. Infected mice shed the virus in their urine, droppings, and saliva. When those materials dry, they become fragile, and when disturbed, they aerosolize. Microscopic particles carrying live virus become airborne, and you breathe them in. That's the entire mechanism. No bite required, no prolonged contact, just the act of disturbing something that's been sitting undisturbed in the wrong place for long enough. The virus enters through the respiratory tract, reaches the lungs, and begins doing something that took researchers years to fully understand. It infects the cells lining the blood vessels, the endothelial cells, specifically inside the pulmonary capillaries, the tiny vessels threaded through your lung tissue, and it disrupts them in a very specific, catastrophic way. Those vessels become permeable. They begin to leak. Fluid that should stay inside the circulatory system starts seeping out into the spaces between cells, into the lung tissue itself. The lungs fill. Not quickly at first. There's a prodromal phase, usually 4 to 10 days, that looks almost identical to influenza. Fever, muscle aches, fatigue, sometimes nausea. Nothing that would make most people think they were in danger. And then, over the course of hours, the transition happens. Breathing becomes harder. A dry cough develops. The body starts working visibly to move air. And within 1 to 2 days of that shift, some patients are in respiratory failure. This is where the immune system re-enters the story, and where age changes the calculation in ways that are not immediately intuitive. The immune response to hantavirus involves a particular kind of immune cell, cytotoxic T lymphocytes, that mobilizes aggressively in response to the viral infection. In severe cases, the concentration of these immune cells in the lung tissue is dramatically elevated. This is called a cytokine storm in its broader form, but in hantavirus specifically, the mechanism is more targeted. The immune system is attacking the virus in the endothelial cells of the pulmonary vasculature, and the collateral damage to those vessel walls, the inflammation, the disruption of tight junctions, is what drives the fluid leakage that fills the lungs. Here's the counterintuitive part that physicians find themselves explaining to families in the hardest conversations. The people who mount the most aggressive immune responses to hantavirus are often the people who suffer the most severe disease. A robust, vigorous immune reaction in the lungs damages the lung vasculature more extensively. It produces more fluid accumulation, more rapidly, which means that a person with a strong immune system can, in some respects, be at greater risk of the most severe pulmonary consequences than someone whose immune response is more muted. Now hold that thought alongside what happens to the immune system after 50. Immune aging, immunosenescence, in clinical language, doesn't mean the immune system simply weakens uniformly. It's a far more complex and, in some ways, more dangerous transformation than that. What tends to decrease is the adaptive immune response, the ability to generate targeted, specific responses to new pathogens. The immunological memory, the precision. What tends to increase or become dysregulated is the inflammatory baseline. Chronic low-grade inflammation, what some researchers call inflammaging, becomes a background state of the immune system in older adults. The system is, in a sense, always slightly activated. This creates a particular kind of vulnerability to pathogens like hantavirus that trigger severe inflammatory responses in the lung. An older immune system may not mount the initial recognition and response as rapidly or precisely as a younger one. But when it does engage, the inflammatory milieu it responds from is already elevated. The baseline is different, and the consequences of a cytokine-mediated lung injury in someone whose vasculature has already been affected by decades of cardiovascular aging, whose pulmonary reserve is different than it was at 35, whose inflammatory regulation is less tightly controlled, those consequences follow a different trajectory. What this means practically is that the window between early symptoms and critical deterioration may be narrower in older adults. The compensatory reserves are different. The ability of the cardiovascular system to maintain perfusion while the lungs are compromised is different, and the clinical presentation, the specific pattern of how symptoms develop and progress, can be atypical in ways that delay recognition. Fever in older adults is frequently blunted. The thermoregulatory response to infection is less reliable after 60, which means the classic high fever that serves as an alarm signal in a younger patient may be absent or significantly reduced in an older one. A 62-year-old with early hantavirus may present with low-grade or even absent fever, pronounced fatigue, mild shortness of breath, and muscle aches, a constellation that, without a history of potential exposure, looks like a dozen other things. That diagnostic ambiguity costs time, and in a disease where the cardiopulmonary phase can deteriorate in hours, time is the entire currency. This is something I think about when I have patients who've spent a weekend at a rural property or done seasonal work around older outbuildings and come in a week or two later feeling unwell. The exposure history is not always volunteered because patients don't always connect the weekend at the cabin with the illness they developed 10 days later. They think about what they ate, who they saw, whether anyone around them was sick. They don't think about the mouse droppings they swept out of the corner before bringing in the firewood. It didn't seem significant at the time. It wasn't a dramatic exposure, it was just cleaning. The exposure history is something you have to ask about and something you have to think about providing if you're seeking care. If you have been in any enclosed space, storage unit, shed, barn, basement, cabin, crawl space, old vehicle, in the weeks before an unexplained febrile illness with respiratory symptoms, that information belongs in the first sentence of your conversation with whoever is evaluating you, not buried at the end, not omitted because it seems irrelevant, up front specifically, with dates and locations, if you can provide them. Because the treatment for hantavirus pulmonary syndrome is almost entirely supportive, there is no targeted antiviral with proven efficacy. The only meaningful clinical intervention is early recognition and early transfer to a facility equipped to provide intensive cardiopulmonary support. Some patients with severe disease require extracorporeal membrane oxygenation, ECMO, which is a form of life support that takes over the work of the heart and lungs externally while the body mounts its response. That intervention is only available at specific centers, and its effectiveness depends heavily on how quickly a patient reaches it. Every hour of unrecognized deterioration at a facility that cannot provide that level of care is a lost hour. This is not said to create a sense of helplessness, the opposite, actually, because the interventions that most directly change the outcome in hantavirus are almost entirely in your hands before any exposure ever happens. Rodent exclusion, the physical prevention of mouse access to structures, is the most effective public health measure available for this disease, and it requires a specific kind of attention to the spaces that older adults are most likely to be responsible for. Deer mice can enter through a gap the size of a dime, gaps around pipes, deteriorated weather stripping, cracks in foundation walls, spaces under doors in outbuildings. These are access points that require actual physical inspection. Not a general impression that the building seems sealed, but deliberate, specific examination of every potential entry point. If you have a seasonal property, a cabin, a hunting camp, a secondary home that's been closed, the ventilation protocol before re-entry matters more than most people realize. Opening windows and doors and allowing fresh air circulation for at least 30 minutes before beginning any cleaning is a basic precaution that significantly reduces the concentration of any aerosolized material. Wearing a properly fitted respirator, not a surgical mask, an N95 or better, when cleaning potentially contaminated enclosed spaces is not an overcaution. It's the appropriate response to a real risk in a specific context. Wet cleaning methods, dampening surfaces with a disinfectant solution before wiping rather than sweeping or vacuuming dry, prevent the aerosolization of dried rodent material. This is a technical distinction that matters. A broom moves particles into the air. A damp cloth with diluted bleach solution captures them. This is the kind of specific operational knowledge that most people never receive because hantavirus education tends to be either too abstract or too alarming to be practically useful. If you are someone who regularly cleans outbuildings, seasonal properties, storage spaces, or rural structures, and if you are over 50, this is the time to establish a cleaning protocol that is specific and consistent, not because exposure is inevitable, because the cost of the precautions is trivial compared to the cost of getting it wrong. The geographic distribution of hantavirus in the United States is worth knowing. Cases are most concentrated in the western states, New Mexico, Colorado, Arizona, Nevada, California, but sin nombre virus and related strains have been identified in deer mouse populations across the entire continental United States. The Four Corners region has historically had the highest case density, which is where the disease was first formally identified in 1993, but "This happens somewhere else" is not an accurate assessment of risk for most Americans who spend time in rural or semi-rural environments. And if this is the first time you're connecting the dots between the spaces you regularly occupy, the shed, the garage, the old family property, and a disease with a 30% mortality rate, I'd encourage you to hold that discomfort for a moment rather than moving past it, because the people who act on this kind of information before an exposure are the people who protect themselves effectively. The people who hear it and think, "That's interesting but probably not relevant to me," are, statistically, the exact population most likely to be relevant to. If you found this useful, if this is the kind of specific, medically honest information you've been looking for and not finding in the usual places, subscribe. What we do here is built for people who want to understand their bodies with precision, not just receive generic reassurance. That kind of understanding takes time to build, and we build it one conversation at a time. The populations most overlooked in infectious disease risk communication are people in middle age and beyond. There's an assumption, implicit in much of public health messaging, that adults over 50 either already know what they need to know or have become somehow less urgent a priority. Neither is true. In fact, the intersection of changing immune function, specific lifestyle patterns, and the kind of low-drama exposures that define rural and semi-rural life after 50 creates a risk profile that deserves direct, specific, honest attention. That's what this is, not alarm for its own sake, not a catalog of things to fear, a specific, honest conversation about a specific, underappreciated risk, and what you can actually do about it before it becomes relevant in the worst way. There is one more dimension worth understanding before we close this out, and it's the one that takes the longest to sit with, the reality that in a disease like this, the people who survive are largely the people who were recognized and transferred to appropriate care early enough. Not the people who had better luck, not the people who were fundamentally healthier, the people who were identified correctly and moved quickly. Which means that the single most powerful thing a person in the 50-plus demographic can do with this information is not just modify their cleaning habits, though they should, but become the kind of informed patient who can walk into an urgent care or emergency room after a potential rural exposure and say, specifically, "I may have been exposed to rodent material in an enclosed space approximately 10 days ago. I have a fever, muscle aches, and I'm having some difficulty breathing. I want to be evaluated for Hantavirus pulmonary syndrome." That sentence changes the clinical encounter. It redirects attention. It triggers a different differential diagnosis. It potentially saves enough time to matter. Knowledge used at the right moment, in the right room, with the right specificity, that is what changes individual outcomes in diseases that otherwise follow their own brutal logic. You now have that knowledge. What you do with it is yours to decide. Leave a comment and tell me something. Do you regularly spend time in rural spaces, outbuildings, or seasonal properties? And had you ever thought about hantavirus as a personal risk before today? I ask because understanding who's watching and what they're actually navigating in their lives shapes everything about how I approach what we cover here.